I remember the first time the Black Sea felt like it was breathing, dark currents pressing against the submersible like hands I couldn't see. I'm a marine biologist, and I've spent years cataloging life forms most people would deny exist, but this expedition wasn't about science. It was about survival. There are 11 strange rules we were told to follow, and I quickly learned that breaking even one can make the water itself turn against you. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. Every bubble felt like a warning, and I can't stop wondering which rule I'll regret breaking first, and if I'll even live to find out. The moment I saw the submersible's outer hatch tremble under the invisible pressure, I remembered the first rule: never open the outer hatch while the currents are shifting. The Black Sea around us was alive in ways I couldn't explain, the water twisting and pressing like some vast, patient predator. Mark leaned over the console, trying to reassure himself more than me, muttering, "It's just a shift in the tide. We've handled this before." But I could feel the weight of the water, the subtle thrum of currents that weren't supposed to be gentle, testing the hull and our patience. Each pulse of the metal made me wonder how many had ignored this rule and never returned. The instruments flickered as pressure gauges jumped and dropped with the shifting water outside. I tightened my grip on the controls and scanned the dim lights of the submersible, the small cabin vibrating with the ocean's subtle wrath. Mark kept glancing at the hatch as if contemplating touching it, and I had to bite back a sharp warning. Outside, shadows danced unpredictably, bending strangely under the distorted light, making it seem like creatures lurked just beyond the glass. The thought alone made my stomach knot. If the hatch gave way even slightly while the currents were in flux, we wouldn't have a second chance. Every movement of the submersible felt amplified, as if the sea itself had memory. The currents weren't random. They moved with purpose, nudging us toward edges we didn't want to approach. I adjusted our thrusters, keeping a delicate balance, and silently noted every pressure reading. Mark whispered about recalibrating the sensors, but I could see the tension in his hands and hear it in the shallow cadence of his breathing. The water outside seemed to pulse with intent, a living entity pressing against the hull, and I realized the rule existed for a reason no manual could teach. Minutes stretched unnaturally as we drifted over a jagged trench, the submersible swaying slightly with each shifting current. The lights from our vessel barely penetrated the murky darkness, and every shadow hinted at hidden forms waiting to respond to any misstep. I recalled stories of divers lost when they had underestimated the subtle force of the Black Sea, their hatches pried open by pressures they couldn't predict. Mark tried to joke about it, but his voice faltered when a particularly strong pulse pressed against the hull, rattling our instruments. It was a silent warning, but the memory of the rule sharpened my focus, reminding me that a lapse could be lethal. The deeper we descended, the heavier the darkness became. I could feel the metal of the submersible bending slightly under the strain, each vibration sending a shiver through my body. Outside, shapes appeared in the dim lights, twisting and receding too quickly to identify, making the water seem almost conscious. Mark shifted uneasily, his hand hovering near the hatch controls, and I had to remind him, quietly, "The hatch stays closed." His nod was tense, but even compliance didn't lessen the oppressive sense that the currents were alive, circling and probing, testing the limits of our craft. Every time I checked the gauges, pressure fluctuated unpredictably, as if the Black Sea was breathing through us. My eyes flicked repeatedly to the hatch, imagining what would happen if it gave way even slightly. The water outside seemed to push and pull, as if attempting to pry us open, and I could sense that the ocean itself was waiting for a single mistake. Mark's skepticism faded with every tremor, replaced by the same cold awareness I felt, that we were not merely floating over the trench, we were exposed, vulnerable, and under scrutiny by forces we couldn't see. Hours passed and the currents shifted in rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. I forced myself to focus on sample collection, but every glance outside reminded me of the consequences of breaking the rule. Shadows moved unnaturally along the hull, and faint streaks of movement hinted at something massive below, stirring in the darkness. Mark muttered quietly about the readings being abnormal, and I didn't respond, knowing that verbal discussion wouldn't protect us. Survival depended on adherence, concentration, and silence, and each minute without error was a victory against the immense pressure outside. A sudden pulse shook the submersible violently, making our lights flicker and sending a cold thrill through my veins. Mark's hand jerked slightly toward the hatch, and I grabbed it, holding it firmly. "Do not even think about it," I whispered, though he was fully aware. The currents pressed harder now, and I realized that the rule wasn't just about mechanical safety. It was about respecting the unseen, about acknowledging that the Black Sea had rules of its own far older and far more merciless than ours. Each microsecond was a test of focus, reflexes, and instinct. I drifted cautiously over a series of rocky outcroppings, the instruments alerting to changes too subtle to see. Outside, I imagined the immense pressure forming into shapes, shadows that could manipulate the water to pry us open. Mark was pale, and I knew he understood instinctively that we couldn't afford a single lapse. I traced the hatch indicators repeatedly, fingers numb with tension, calculating the exact moment when a sudden current might challenge our small craft. The weight of the ocean reminded me again why we had the rule, and that even compliance didn't guarantee safety. The trench stretched endlessly beneath us, darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. Vibrations ran through the hull like slow footsteps, subtle and deliberate. Mark's whispers had stopped, replaced by tense breathing as he stared at the instruments. I couldn't let my focus slip. One careless movement could be fatal. Each subtle twist of the submersible reminded me that the rule had been given for more than caution. It was the difference between floating alive and being crushed by what lurked in the depths. Even as we collected samples, the hatch remained locked, the currents dancing around us like unseen predators. Shadows shifted with unnatural speed, and I could sense the ocean probing, testing. Mark fumbled with a sample container, and I reminded him to stay still, feeling my pulse accelerate with every subtle tremor. The Black Sea's darkness was absolute, and we were nothing but fragile vessels suspended within it, dependent on rules that, if ignored, became the line between life and death. Minutes bled into hours, and the currents showed no signs of easing. I traced every reading, adjusted every thruster, and refused to take my eyes off the water. Even small deviations could have catastrophic consequences, and the submersible groaned under the strain. I could sense Mark's awareness rising, finally acknowledging the danger without needing further warning. Outside, something shifted in the murk, a shadow too massive to identify, reminding us that adherence to the rule was the only thing keeping us intact. By the time we finally found a stretch of calmer water, the hatch had endured relentless pressure, and the submersible seemed to sigh in relief along with us. Mark exhaled shakily, but I knew we weren't out of danger. Each pulse, each creak of metal, and each flicker of shadow reminded me that Rule 1 had kept us alive, but only barely. The currents would return, stronger, more deliberate, and the ocean would continue testing us. Compliance had been temporary salvation. Vigilance would determine whether we survived the next shift. I couldn't take my eyes off Mark. As we moved into the deeper darkness, the lights from our submersible cutting through the murky water like fragile threads. Always maintain visual contact with your partner during descent. The second rule etched into my memory wasn't just a guideline, it was survival. Even a momentary lapse could leave one of us exposed to the Black Sea's hidden threats. Currents twisting around shapes we couldn't identify. Mark's face reflected the dim cabin lights, tight with tension, and I could sense the pull of the abyss outside, waiting for someone to drift too far. Every glance away made the water seem more threatening, more alive, as if it were testing our discipline. The deeper we went, the more the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against the submersible as though trying to separate us. Mark fidgeted with the control panel, trying to distract himself from the tension, but I could feel his unease radiating in the enclosed cabin. Each movement of the submersible reminded me that staying close wasn't just about teamwork, it was about survival, about ensuring neither of us was ever alone. When the currents decided to play tricks, shadows beyond the glass hinted at forms we couldn't identify, moving faster than our lights could track. a silent warning of the dangers lurking unseen. I adjusted the lights to illuminate Mark's position constantly, refusing to let him slip from view for even a second. The submersible groaned as the pressure increased with depth, metal twisting imperceptibly under the weight of water, and I realized that visual contact was as much about reassurance as it was about awareness. Mark's hand brushed against mine briefly, a small reminder that we were still tethered together by necessity and training. The water pressed harder outside, flowing in unseen eddies that threatened to push us apart, and I felt the significance of Rule 2 settle like a stone in my stomach. Moments later, the instruments registered a sudden shift in pressure, and I had to maneuver the submersible carefully to avoid being caught in a current that could yank us away from each other. The water outside rippled with a strange consistency, and I had an instinctive shiver as I imagined what could happen if one of us strayed. Mark murmured a question about whether the readings were normal, and I didn't answer. Any conversation that distracted from maintaining visual contact could be fatal. Every pulse of light reflecting off the hatch or hull was another tether to ensure we remained synchronized, our survival dependent on our mutual awareness. As we drifted near a jagged outcropping, shapes shifted in the darkness just beyond our lights. My heart raced, knowing that if we weren't watching each other, one of us could be drawn into the shadows without a trace. I guided Mark's attention back whenever his gaze wavered, reminding him silently that we had no margin for error. The water itself seemed alive, twisting around us in ways that made it difficult to judge distance and direction. Maintaining visual contact wasn't just a rule, it was a fragile lifeline tethering us to reality and each other amidst the oppressive shifting darkness. The submersible rocked slightly as another unseen current swept beneath us, forcing me to adjust our trajectory while keeping Mark in sight. His eyes darted to strange silhouettes moving in the gloom, and I felt a tension coiling in my chest as I guided him back to a clear line of sight. Shadows shifted faster than our lights could follow, almost as if the ocean itself were aware of our connection and testing it. Every moment I looked away, I felt a pang of dread, a sense that something massive could strike if we weren't careful. Rule 2 wasn't about mere compliance. It was about the unspoken, omnipresent danger just beyond our fragile bubble of light. I realized that even in calm stretches, the Black Sea refused to relent. Pressure readings remained erratic, and strange forms appeared and vanished beyond our illumination. Mark adjusted his position instinctively whenever the submersible tilted, a silent acknowledgement that we were safer together than apart. The water flowed around us like fingers, probing and testing, and I could feel the weight of the abyss pressing at the limits of our vessel. Maintaining visual contact became a battle of awareness, reflex, and trust, and I knew that even one lapse could be catastrophic. Hours passed as we moved deeper, each second stretching with the tension of knowing how fragile our coordination was. I tracked Mark's movements with near-obsessive care, adjusting the lights and thrusters to ensure he never slipped from sight. Outside, darkness twisted unnaturally, sometimes forming shapes that mimicked familiar objects or creatures, and I realized that the Black Sea's environment was actively trying to disorient us. We were tethered by the rule, by training, and by necessity, knowing that failing to maintain visual contact could mean one of us would vanish without a trace. The water pressure continued to fluctuate, subtle yet persistent, and I felt the submersible bend slightly under the strain. I reminded myself silently that every glance and every maneuver was a test of discipline, a test of Rule 2, even if we weren't acknowledging it aloud. Mark's presence was my anchor, and mine was his, a silent agreement that we would not let the currents separate us. Shadows darted along the hull as the lights caught fleeting glimpses of movement beneath us, and each time I tightened my grip, I felt the unspoken weight of responsibility pressing down on both of us. Even as we collected samples and made measurements, the rule dictated every decision. I refused to let Mark drift to the edges of our lights, adjusted thrusters carefully, and monitored every sensor to anticipate changes in current. The darkness outside was constant, alive, and testing us relentlessly. I could see the tension in Mark's posture, the quickened rhythm of his breath, and I knew he understood. Any momentary lapse in maintaining visual contact could trigger disaster. We were isolated in the depths, suspended between life and the unknown, and the second rule was the only thing keeping us tethered. Hours blurred together as the trench stretched endlessly beneath us, the submersible vibrating slightly with each invisible movement in the water. Shadows darted unpredictably, currents twisted in imperceptible eddies, and I focused entirely on Mark, scanning his position and adjusting our lights to ensure a constant tether. The tension built steadily, a low hum in the back of my mind, reminding me that the rule was not optional. If either of us strayed or lost track of the other, the ocean would claim us without hesitation. Maintaining visual contact was more than protocol, it was the line separating survival from being swallowed by the abyss. By the time we reached a slightly calmer stretch of water, I could feel our exhaustion in every motion. We were still together, still alive, but the oppressive darkness outside continued to press against the submersible. I knew the Black Sea would continue testing us, that currents would shift again, and that even the smallest misstep could unravel our careful coordination. The rule had held us intact so far, but I understood that this was only the beginning, and that further challenges awaited in the depths that had already proven how deadly compliance or failure could be. The thought hit me suddenly, as the submersible tilted slightly in response to a shifting current, and I remembered the third rule: never remove your helmet inside the submersible, unless the pressure is stable. The water beyond the glass seemed to pulse with intent, and I could feel how fragile our isolation had become. Mark adjusted a sensor, his face pale beneath the helmet, glancing at me with the unspoken acknowledgement that this was more than just a guideline. Every movement, every breath was a calculation, a balancing act between curiosity and survival, in a place that tolerated no mistakes. The pressure outside pressed on the hull, whispering warnings that could kill if ignored. I could sense Mark's hesitation as he reached toward a panel, his hand trembling slightly under the dim cabin lights. I reminded him quietly, though the words felt almost unnecessary, removing a helmet here even for a second could be fatal. Outside, the currents tugged against the submersible unpredictably, and shadows twisted in ways that made familiar shapes unrecognizable. I tried to focus on the instruments, but the water seemed to move with a life of its own, teasing, prodding, testing our attention. Even the tiniest lapse could allow the Black Sea to exploit our vulnerability. Every adjustment of the submersible now carried weight I hadn't felt before. Mark was fidgeting with a small compartment, debating whether to remove his helmet to reach a tool, and I caught myself holding my breath. The metal groaned under the pressure, faint vibrations running through the cabin, as if the ocean itself were assessing our resolve. I guided him back verbally, careful to keep my voice low, knowing that panic would spread like wildfire in the confined space. The third rule wasn't just about safety. It was about respecting the unseen force pressing against us from every direction. The shadows outside danced strangely as we moved over a sunken ridge, and I realized the Black Sea was almost sentient in its subtle manipulations. Pressure spikes made the submersible shudder, and I could feel the tiny vibrations of our vessel resonating through the cabin. Mark's hand hovered near his helmet, his eyes flicking toward the latch, and I had to redirect him with the steady reminder of the rule. The environment was testing us, and the consequences of failure were immediate and unforgiving. Removing our helmets here wasn't a mistake, it was an invitation to disaster. Hours seemed to stretch as currents shifted again, more forceful this time, bending the submersible slightly under their push. The lights barely penetrated the murky darkness outside, and fleeting shadows reminded me of the depth's unpredictability. Mark whispered about adjusting pressure levels, but I ignored the conversation, focusing on maintaining control and awareness. Each motion we made was dictated by the need to follow the rule, knowing that a single careless movement could compromise the hull's integrity. Our isolation was complete, and the water pressed against us like a living entity demanding obedience. I could feel Mark's tension rising, as he attempted to manipulate the samples collected earlier. One wrong move, one slip in judgment, and we could be exposed to the crushing pressure outside. I adjusted our position slowly, lights tracing his movements to ensure he remained tethered to safety. The submersible groaned faintly, a reminder that the rules weren't arbitrary. They existed because the ocean had claimed too many who ignored them. Even routine actions required vigilance, the tiniest misstep magnified under the immense weight surrounding us. The trench beneath us stretched endlessly, black and silent, yet somehow alive with suggestion. Every subtle vibration of the hull made my stomach tighten. Every shift of shadow outside reminded me of how delicate our situation was. Mark's eyes met mine briefly, an unspoken agreement that helmets stayed on until the pressure stabilized. I traced my fingers over the controls, confirming every gauge, every readout, knowing that even the most minor lapse could be fatal. The Black Sea did not forgive recklessness. As we drifted past jagged formations, the currents tugged at us unexpectedly, causing a brief tilt that rattled the cabin slightly. I could see Mark stiffen, hand reflexively moving toward his helmet, and I whispered a reminder, grounding both of us in reality. The shadowy water seemed to respond, as though the abyss itself was aware of our compliance and watching for any defiance. Following the rule became an instinct, a protective rhythm, and I realized that our survival depended as much on our focus as on the metal hull encasing us. Even during sample collection, the weight of the water pressed against us, unyielding and patient. Every adjustment of instruments or containers had to be precise, calculated, and performed without breaking the rule. Mark's breathing was audible, shallow and steady, evidence of his understanding that one careless action could expose us to lethal pressure. The ocean seemed almost sentient, shifting subtly with every motion, reminding us that we were not merely observers but participants in a dangerous ballet of forces far beyond human control. The hours bled together as the trench stretched beneath, and the submersible creaked faintly with the immense pressure. I could feel the tension in Mark's shoulders, see it in his eyes, and I knew he understood the silent gravity of the third rule. Shadows outside moved faster, and the water twisted in unpredictable currents, making each maneuver a test of vigilance. Following Rule 3 wasn't just about mechanics, it was about anticipating threats we couldn't see, respecting a force that could end us without a single warning. Even when the pressure seemed to stabilize, the darkness beyond our lights hinted at forms we couldn't comprehend. I adjusted thrusters to maintain balance, eyes flicking constantly between Mark and the instruments. The cabin was a bubble of fragile safety, and removing helmets would shatter that bubble instantly. Every second reinforced the importance of the rule, a lesson written in the silent, immense force of the water around us. I knew this was only the beginning, and that the Black Sea had more ways to test our discipline than we could anticipate. By the time we reached a slightly calmer section of the trench, Mark exhaled shakily, but kept his helmet on, acknowledging the lesson silently. The submersible creaked under the immense pressures still pressing against the hull, a reminder that obedience was temporary salvation. Even though we survived this stretch intact, the ocean's patient weight reminded me that a single lapse in following the third rule could undo everything. Shadows flickered beyond the glass, hinting that our vigilance would be tested again very soon, and that the abyss wasn't done with us. I glanced at the containers of collected samples, my hands hovering over the glass jars, and reminded myself immediately of the fourth rule. Never touch unknown specimens without gloves and full protective gear. The Black Sea was deceptive, hiding dangers in forms that seemed harmless until it was too late. Mark shifted nervously beside me, reaching for a sample, and I caught his hand, steadying it before he could make a fatal mistake. The water outside pressed in, black and heavy, shadows twisting against the submersible's lights in ways that made ordinary shapes seem alive. Even a momentary lapse in caution could have consequences we weren't prepared to survive. The deeper we went, the more the pressure seemed to amplify even the smallest tremors inside the cabin. I carefully adjusted the instruments, checking the chemical analysis monitors while ensuring Mark didn't inadvertently brush against an untested specimen. The ocean outside was unpredictable, its currents tugging subtly at our fragile vessel, and I could feel my pulse spike with every shadow that flickered past. Gloves and protective gear weren't just bureaucracy. They were shields against an environment that refused to forgive carelessness. Each minute reminded me of how small and exposed we really were. Mark fidgeted with a sample that looked harmless, a pale luminescent organism floating in its jar. I spoke sharply, reminding him of the rule without needing to reference it again. A single touch could introduce toxins, infectious matter, or trigger reactions we couldn't predict. The water outside seemed to press harder, almost in response to our proximity to the unknown, testing our vigilance. I reminded myself that the ocean held creatures that had adapted to extreme depths in ways humans couldn't survive without protection, and even the smallest oversight could be catastrophic. Hours passed as we cataloged and analyzed specimens, each one more bizarre than the last. Shadows shifted outside, sometimes suggesting movement that wasn't there, and I realized how important it was to remain disciplined. Mark's hesitation was visible as he reached for a container, and I held my hand over his, guiding him back to safe protocol. The ocean's silence pressed in around us, a subtle, omnipresent reminder that it watched, that it remembered, and that every touch could awaken consequences far beyond our control. Compliance was the only way to keep the vessel and ourselves intact. The submersible groaned slightly under pressure changes, vibrations echoing through the hull and making the air feel heavier. I kept scanning every instrument, every gauge and every shadow, ensuring nothing in the cabin or outside threatened our fragile safety. The specimens were fascinating, but I couldn't let curiosity overcome caution. Mark's eyes lingered on a particularly strange organism, glowing faintly, and I reminded him once more, calm but firm, that Rule 4 existed for survival, not convenience. The abyss outside pressed in, patient and relentless, testing our discipline with every passing second. Even as we adjusted the submersible to compensate for subtle currents, the weight of the water seemed alive, bending light and shadow in ways that made every movement inside critical. I ensured gloves and protective gear were secured, monitoring Mark as he moved carefully. The Black Sea's darkness was oppressive, wrapping around the hull and amplifying the smallest mistakes. Outside, currents shifted subtly, pressing and pulling, reminding me that discipline and caution weren't optional. They were the difference between life and death. We drifted past jagged rock formations, where bioluminescent creatures flickered in and out of view, mesmerizing yet threatening. Every time Mark tried to manipulate a sample, I had to remind him silently to be careful, to never touch without protection. The shadows seemed to react, currents tugging as if testing our awareness, and I felt the tension in my shoulders tighten with every movement. The fourth rule was not just practical, it was a defense against an unseen predator, a measure that could save or end our lives in a single misstep. As the hours stretched on, the submersible tilted slightly under unexpected currents, making even small adjustments a delicate procedure. I held my hand steady, monitoring every movement inside the cabin, knowing that one wrong motion could compromise the safety of the specimens and ourselves. Mark exhaled shakily, finally acknowledging silently that the rule was absolute, and that curiosity could be fatal. Shadows outside flickered like phantoms, reminders that even the tiniest touch could awaken something that had been lying in wait in the darkness for centuries. The tension in the cabin grew as we moved further into the trench, deeper than any previous dive. Every sample seemed more alien than the last, some writhing subtly, reacting to movement we could not detect. I reminded myself again silently that Rule 4 existed to shield us from forces we could neither anticipate nor resist. Mark's movements became more precise, careful, each touch deliberate and measured. The water outside felt like a living entity, patient and watching, waiting for the first lapse to punish. By the time we reached a relatively calm stretch, our hands were numb from the gloves, our muscles tense from constant vigilance. The submersible groaned under subtle pressure changes, a reminder that the environment remained hostile, indifferent, and alive. We had adhered to the fourth rule perfectly, but I knew survival depended on continued discipline. Even in moments of apparent calm, the Black Sea whispered through shadows, suggesting that failure at the wrong time could undo everything we had fought to maintain. The eerie luminescence outside highlighted strange formations of rock and water currents, reminding me how alien the depths truly were. I observed every movement of Mark's hands, every twitch of his body, ensuring that curiosity never overrode caution. The submersible's lights caught on a particularly odd organism, pulsating slowly, mesmerizing yet potentially deadly. I reminded myself again that compliance with the rule wasn't just adherence. It was our lifeline in a world that had no tolerance for mistakes. Shadows shifted, currents twisted, and I realized that the ocean would continue testing our discipline long after this stretch ended. I stared at the glowing screens, numbers flickering across every monitor, and reminded myself of the fifth rule: never rely solely on instruments. Trust your instincts underwater. The Black Sea had a way of twisting reality, of making the familiar seem alien, and I could feel the submersible responding to currents that the gauges hadn't yet registered. Mark leaned over, eyes glued to a panel, muttering about discrepancies, but instinct screamed louder than any reading. Every shadow outside the glass seemed to have purpose, shifting unnaturally, testing our perception. I realized then that instruments could fail, but intuition, our human awareness, was the line that separated survival from catastrophe. The deeper we descended, the more the water seemed alive, pressing against the hull with a silent insistence that mocked our technology. I ignored minor fluctuations that made Mark nervous, choosing instead to trust the rhythm of the currents my body felt through every vibration of the vessel. Shadows flickered and twisted outside, and the instruments, precise as they were, could not predict the subtle shifts in the abyss. I whispered a reminder to myself. Our senses, honed by experience and fear, were as vital as any gauge, any readout. The ocean demanded awareness beyond numbers, beyond logic, and I could feel its weight pressing in on every side. Mark tapped nervously on the console, pointing to a reading I already knew was misleading. I shook my head subtly, refusing to let the submersible's instruments override the gut feeling growing in my chest. The currents tugged unpredictably, moving faster than any sensor could calculate, and I adjusted our course instinctively. Outside, shapes flickered, twisting into forms that shouldn't exist in the light of our submersible. I realized that the ocean could outthink the machines we trusted. Intuition wasn't optional here. It was survival. Minutes bled into hours as we navigated the trench, each pulse of vibration through the hull confirming the subtle messages my instincts sent. Mark hesitated at every decision, staring at numbers instead of watching the water around us, and I had to guide him silently, demonstrating through movement what the gauges could not explain. The Black Sea's darkness was oppressive, hiding currents and forms that instruments could not account for, and I felt the ever-present tension in the cabin grow heavier with each passing second. Instinct was our compass when technology faltered. A sudden tug from below made the submersible lurch slightly, and I realized that ignoring instinct even for a moment could be deadly. I adjusted the thrusters without looking at the screen, letting the vibrations and subtle sway of the hull dictate the movements. Mark's breath caught as he followed my lead, and I could sense his disbelief turning into reluctant trust. Outside, shadows danced in ways the instruments hadn't anticipated, shapes that seemed aware of our intrusion. The fifth rule reminded me that the Black Sea did not respond to numbers. It responded to awareness, experience, and the sharpness of the human mind. Even during sample collection, the ocean tested us, currents pulling at the submersible with tiny, almost imperceptible motions. I ignored the warning lights that screamed caution, relying instead on the vibrations through the hull and the subtle shifts in the water I could feel. Mark followed hesitantly, eyes wide, learning to combine observation with instinct. The abyss beyond the light seemed alive, responding to our movements, testing our coordination. Every twitch of the vessel reminded me that numbers alone would not protect us. Awareness, intuition, and respect for the unseen were our only defenses. The trench deepened, darkness swallowing the weak beams of our lights, and the submersible groaned under pressure changes that instruments barely registered. Shadows flickered across the hull, forming shapes that twisted in impossible ways, challenging both logic and sensor readings. I adjusted course again, trusting the sense of motion beneath my hands, the vibration in the metal, and the instinct that told me where the currents would strike next. Mark whispered about a reading being abnormal, but I shook my head silently, refusing to let a number dictate our survival. Trusting instincts was the only way to remain alive. Hours stretched as we moved farther into the abyss, each second weighed down by the oppressive darkness outside. I noted every twitch in the submersible's movements, every shift in currents, letting instinct guide decisions about orientation, speed, and positioning. Mark had stopped questioning, following my lead with careful precision. The Black Sea seemed to respond to hesitation, currents twisting to test our resolve. I reminded myself internally that the instruments were only tools, nothing more, and the real guardian here was awareness. Even as we documented and stored specimens, the water pressed against the hull with silent menace. Shadows beyond the lights flickered unpredictably, shapes that moved too quickly or shifted in impossible ways. I let instinct dictate positioning, even when the gauges indicated stability, feeling every pull and subtle vibration through my hands and feet. Mark moved cautiously, finally recognizing that intuition could sense dangers the instruments could not. The fifth rule wasn't just guidance. It was the difference between life and death in a place that ignored human logic. By the time we reached a slightly calmer area, I could feel exhaustion setting in, tension etched in every muscle. The submersible groaned faintly under subtle pressure changes, and shadows twisted beyond the hull, reminding me that the ocean never truly rested. I glanced at Mark, eyes weary, hands tense, and silently acknowledged that we had survived this stretch, because instinct had guided us where instruments could not. Even when readings appeared normal, the Black Sea demanded vigilance, intuition, and respect. The fifth rule had kept us intact, but I knew it would be tested again the moment we descended further into darkness. The moment I considered stepping away to adjust a sample container, I remembered the sixth rule: never leave the submersible unattended, even for a moment. The Black Sea was patient and insidious, filled with currents that moved like hidden predators and shadows that seemed aware of every motion. Mark was busy cataloging specimens, his attention split, and I realized how easily a lapse could allow disaster to strike. Even a few seconds of absence could give the ocean an opportunity to test our defenses, to exploit a vulnerability that neither of us could afford. Every glance outside reminded me that we were isolated, fragile, and under constant scrutiny. The deeper we sank into the trench, the more the submersible felt like a tiny island in an endless sea of darkness. Vibrations ran through the metal, subtle but unmistakable, as if the ocean were pressing its invisible hands against us, demanding obedience. Mark tried to reach for a tool on the far side of the cabin, but I caught his sleeve, grounding him in place with a silent warning. The rule was absolute. Leaving even briefly could expose the vessel to the pressures beyond, or worse, the unseen forms lurking in the shadows. Survival required constant vigilance, an unbroken chain of observation and awareness. Currents shifted abruptly, causing the submersible to sway slightly and sending shadows outside into erratic motion. I clutched the controls tightly, aware that any distraction could compromise our stability. Mark's hands hovered over instruments, hesitant, and I reminded him without words that the sixth rule demanded presence at all times. Even the faintest lapse could be catastrophic, the difference between staying intact and being torn apart by forces that waited patiently for mistakes. Every vibration, every subtle push of water against the hull reinforced the necessity of unwavering attention. Hours passed, each moment stretching with unbearable weight as the trench swallowed us deeper. I monitored every movement, every subtle tremor in the hull, knowing that leaving the submersible, even to check an instrument, would invite disaster. Shadows outside seemed to flicker and twist with awareness, moving faster than our lights could track, suggesting forms too vast or too strange to comprehend. Mark's gaze occasionally wandered to the darkness beyond the glass, and I had to guide his attention back to the instruments and our immediate surroundings. The abyss tolerated no absence, no distraction. We drifted past jagged outcroppings that jutted from the seabed like broken teeth, the lights of the submersible barely penetrating the darkness. Every pulse of the hull was magnified in the quiet cabin, and I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. Mark fidgeted with sample containers, his hands trembling slightly, but I reminded him internally that the sixth rule was not negotiable. Leaving the submersible unattended, even for a fleeting moment, would be a fatal error, and the currents would exploit it with a patience no human could match. Shadows moved unnaturally outside, almost as if sensing our vigilance, or lack thereof. The submersible groaned under subtle pressure changes, and the darkness beyond seemed to stretch and breathe, alive in ways that the instruments could not measure. I adjusted our thrusters to counteract the slightest drift, feeling every pulse of the water through the hull and maintaining constant awareness of Mark's movements. Each second demanded focus, each flicker of shadow a reminder that we were surrounded by forces that did not forgive carelessness. Even minor distractions could leave us exposed to the crushing weight of the sea or forms that lurked just beyond the lights. Mark attempted to adjust a control panel, but I stayed close, hand hovering near his, ready to intervene. The submersible swayed again under the currents, and I realized that the Black Sea was testing not just our skill, but our discipline. Leaving the vessel unattended, even momentarily, was an invitation for the darkness outside to take advantage of our absence. The sixth rule existed not only to protect us, but to prevent the ocean itself from claiming what it could. Shadows flickered outside, reminding me that compliance and vigilance were inseparable from survival. As we drifted further into the trench, the darkness outside deepened, and the currents grew more unpredictable. Each small tremor in the hull felt magnified, an invisible pulse through the vessel that warned of danger we could not yet see. I kept Mark close, guiding his movements, ensuring that no part of the submersible was left unmonitored. The Black Sea was patient, unyielding, and aware, and I knew that even a momentary lapse could unravel everything. Rule 6 demanded constant attention, and the ocean's pressure reminded me of its absolute authority. Even during specimen collection, I remained vigilant, eyes flicking between instruments, Mark and the shadows outside. The submersible vibrated under the weight of invisible currents, and shapes moved beyond our lights in ways that suggested intent. Any attempt to step away, any momentary absence, could have been fatal. The sixth rule wasn't just a guideline, it was the fragile line separating life from disaster in a place where darkness and pressure had dominion. The Black Sea tolerated no negligence, and I understood more deeply than ever why this rule existed. Hours bled into one another, each second heavy with tension as we navigated the trench. The currents pushed and pulled subtly, testing our balance and awareness, while shadows flickered outside, forming shapes that seemed too deliberate to be random. I ensured that neither Mark nor I moved away from our posts, knowing that leaving the submersible unattended would mean surrendering to forces beyond comprehension. The lesson of the sixth rule was clear: constant vigilance was the only thing keeping us alive. The ocean watched, measured, and waited, and only attention could protect us from what lingered just beyond the glass. By the time we reached a slightly calmer stretch, both Mark and I were exhausted, every muscle tense, every nerve alive with awareness. The submersible creaked faintly under subtle pressure fluctuations, reminding us that the Black Sea was indifferent to human endurance. Our survival had depended on adhering to the sixth rule perfectly. Even a brief lapse could have been catastrophic. Shadows flickered beyond the lights, subtle and menacing, a silent reminder that the ocean's patient tests were far from over, and that leaving the vessel unattended would have been a death sentence. The faint, almost imperceptible hum caught my attention first, a vibration that didn't match the submersible's engines, and I immediately thought of the seventh rule: never ignore unusual sounds or vibrations in the hull. Mark glanced at me, questioning whether it was just the pressure settling, but instinct told me otherwise. The Black Sea was full of anomalies, hidden currents, and creatures whose presence could only be sensed indirectly. I traced the vibrations with my hands along the metal, noting every subtle pulse, every quiver that hinted at forces moving outside our fragile protective bubble. Ignoring these warnings could be fatal, and the deeper we went, the more I realized how alive the ocean truly was. The hum intensified sporadically, resonating through the cabin, making my teeth clench with tension. I adjusted the thrusters slightly, testing whether the vibration was caused by our movement or something external. Mark's eyes widened as shadows outside shifted in ways that seemed synchronized with the hum, and I felt the weight of the abyss pressing even harder. Every moment we hesitated increased the danger. The ocean was patient but precise, waiting for the first sign of complacency. I reminded myself silently that the seventh rule existed, because survival required awareness of forces we couldn't always see. Minutes later, another subtle pulse reverberated through the submersible, almost like a heartbeat from the depths. I placed my hands firmly on the controls, monitoring instruments while feeling the vibrations through every fiber of my being. Mark whispered a question about structural integrity, but I shook my head, indicating that the instruments wouldn't tell us everything. The seventh rule demanded more than reading gauges. It demanded attention, intuition, and trust in the subtle cues the ocean provided. The shadows outside flickered unnaturally, and I realized that ignoring even a whisper of warning could cost us everything. As we maneuvered past jagged rock formations, the vibrations shifted in frequency and intensity, suggesting movement beyond our perception. I instructed Mark silently to stay calm, to focus on the cabin and instruments, but our survival depended on interpreting what the machines could not. Every groan of metal, every pulse of water against the hull became a signal, a guide, a potential warning. The Black Sea had a rhythm of its own, and we had to learn it or succumb to it. The seventh rule was less about caution and more about listening to the subtle, omnipresent life of the abyss. The hum grew irregular, almost conversational, as though the trench itself were communicating in a language we could barely comprehend. I adjusted the lights, scanning shadows that twisted in impossible ways, and Mark mirrored my movements, eyes wide and alert. Even the tiniest vibration could indicate a shift in the currents, the approach of unseen creatures, or a structural compromise in the submersible. Ignoring these signs wasn't an option. The seventh rule demanded that every nuance be acknowledged and acted upon. The darkness outside seemed aware, moving with intent, testing our focus and resilience. Hours passed as the vibrations ebbed and flowed, never constant, never predictable. Each pulse brought a fresh wave of tension, forcing us to reconcile our observations with instinct and experience. Mark flinched as the submersible tilted slightly under unseen forces, and I reached over to steady him, silently reinforcing the necessity of the rule. Shadows danced across the hull, moving faster than our lights could track, and I realized how vulnerable we were to the Black Sea's subtle manipulations. The seventh rule was the line that separated awareness from catastrophe, and we had to respect it at all times. Even while taking readings and cataloging specimens, the vibrations never ceased. I could feel them resonating through my arms and legs, a constant reminder of the immense pressure and hidden dangers surrounding us. Mark tried to dismiss one particular pulse as trivial, but I caught his arm and shook my head slightly, a non-verbal warning to stay vigilant. The ocean had a language of its own, one that spoke through vibrations and sound, and obeying the seventh rule meant listening carefully to every warning. Shadows flickered, currents shifted, and the abyss waited for the first sign of complacency. The deeper we descended, the more pronounced the vibrations became, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp enough to make the submersible shudder. I traced each pulse through the metal, cross-referencing with our instruments, while trusting my instincts to interpret what the sensors could not. Mark mirrored my movements, a silent acknowledgement that the seventh rule demanded our full attention. The Black Sea seemed to react to any lapse, to amplify shadows and currents when vigilance wavered. Ignoring even one unusual sound could spell disaster. A sudden low-frequency vibration reverberated through the cabin, making my stomach twist. Shadows beyond the glass shifted, forming shapes that defied logic, moving almost as if responding to the pulse. I gripped the controls tightly, guiding the submersible carefully, knowing that instinct and the rule were our only guides. Mark held his breath, eyes wide, realizing that the Black Sea didn't just push against metal, it tested minds, instincts, and nerves. Compliance with the seventh rule wasn't optional, it was the fragile line keeping us tethered to life. By the time we reached a slightly calmer section of the trench, my muscles were tense, nerves frayed, yet the hum persisted faintly beneath everything. Every vibration, every ghost of a sound, reminded me that we were at the mercy of an environment older and larger than anything we could comprehend. Mark exhaled shakily, but remained alert, understanding silently that the seventh rule had kept us alive through this stretch. The shadows outside shifted subtly, teasing, patient, as if promising that the ocean's tests were far from over, and that ignoring unusual signals would carry consequences far beyond comprehension. I could feel a false sense of calm settling over the cabin, a dangerous trick of the abyss, and I immediately thought of the eighth rule: never turn off the submersible's external lights, no matter how calm it seems. Mark reached instinctively toward the control panel, murmuring about conserving power, but I caught his hand mid-motion. Darkness in the Black Sea wasn't empty. It was a living presence, shifting and twisting just beyond the beams of light we controlled. One moment of complacency, one blink in the darkness, could leave us vulnerable to forces we could neither see nor predict. The lights weren't convenience. They were lifelines against an environment designed to kill without mercy. As we drifted deeper, shadows lengthened unnaturally outside the reinforced glass, stretching and twisting in ways the instruments couldn't explain. I kept the external lights steady, scanning every nook of the water, every ripple that could conceal movement. Mark hesitated, eyes darting toward the dim glow of the power meter, and I shook my head silently. The eighth rule wasn't about saving energy. It was about survival. Darkness could hide creatures, currents, or sudden anomalies that would strike instantly, leaving no chance for correction. Every moment without light was a gamble. The Black Sea was sure to exploit. The submersible creaked faintly as the water pressure pressed in unevenly, subtle vibrations making it impossible to ignore the weight of the ocean around us. I moved the controls carefully, ensuring that our lights illuminated everything within reach, cutting swaths through the oppressive black. Mark followed my lead, finally acknowledging that the eighth rule was absolute, that even a few seconds of darkness could have consequences beyond imagination. Shadows flickered, suggesting forms too large or fast to comprehend, reinforcing that the ocean never gave warnings twice. Ignoring this rule, even briefly, could be fatal. Minutes stretched as we navigated through jagged rock formations, the glow from our submersible revealing alien terrain. Every flicker in the water, every subtle motion, reminded me that turning off the lights was unthinkable. Mark kept glancing at the energy gauge, tension radiating from him as though the ocean could read his thoughts. I reminded myself silently that the lights were our barrier against uncertainty, our defense against whatever lurked unseen. The Black Sea tolerated no false sense of security, and compliance with the eighth rule wasn't optional. It was the margin between survival and being consumed. The deeper we went, the more unstable the currents became, tugging at the submersible and making shadows outside dance in unnatural patterns. I adjusted the lights constantly, casting beams into the darkness, revealing nothing yet suggesting everything. Mark whispered about conserving power again, and I gripped his shoulder, silently emphasizing that the ocean's patience had limits. Darkness was an invitation in the Black Sea, a portal for things that observed, waited, and tested. Keeping the lights on was our only reassurance, a tether to sanity, a shield against the unknown. Even during sample collection, I kept my eyes on the lights and the water beyond, refusing to let the room fall into shadows. Subtle vibrations ran through the hull as currents shifted unexpectedly, and I could feel the submersible's minute sway as I traced shapes that flickered just beyond visibility. Mark mirrored my movements, careful now, understanding that compliance with the eighth rule meant constant awareness and vigilance. The abyss beyond the lights was patient, waiting for distraction, for darkness, for a single misstep. Ignoring the lights could be lethal, and I felt every pulse of water as a reminder of the rule's importance. The submersible tilted slightly as a sudden current swept beneath us, and I adjusted thrusters carefully to maintain a steady course. Shadows stretched and coiled outside, forming shapes too deliberate to be random, shapes that seemed to respond to any faltering of our vigilance. Mark's hands hovered near the panel, reluctant to adjust the lights, and I guided them with quiet authority. The eighth rule was clear: darkness was not our friend, and the moment it touched us, survival became a question, not a certainty. The Black Sea thrived in shadows, and we had no choice but to resist them fully. Hours passed as we moved through the trench, each second magnifying tension, each flicker of shadow reminding me of what lay just beyond our beams. I adjusted every light, scanned every movement, and noted how the abyss seemed almost aware of our discipline. Mark's anxiety was evident, but he followed without question, understanding that even a momentary lapse in illumination could expose us to forces we had no hope of surviving. The lights weren't just tools, they were lifelines against an environment designed to punish hesitation. Compliance with the eighth rule was absolute, non-negotiable, and constant. Even when the trench opened into a slightly wider basin, I refused to let the lights dim. The stillness was deceptive, a trap for the unwary, and I felt a chill that wasn't from the water but from anticipation. Shadows outside twisted in strange, mesmerizing patterns, daring us to blink, to falter, to consider conserving energy. Mark exhaled shakily, but didn't touch the panel again, finally accepting that the rule was more than protocol, it was survival. Darkness was a predator here, subtle, patient, and unyielding, and we could not afford to give it even a single advantage. By the time we reached a temporary calm in the trench, the lights illuminated strange rock formations and drifting organisms, a brief relief in the oppressive depths. Yet the Black Sea remained alive and patient, its currents shifting faintly, as if testing whether we were still vigilant. I knew that every second of darkness could have been fatal, and I kept scanning the shadows beyond the beams, alert for movement that no instrument could detect. The eighth rule had preserved our position, kept us tethered to safety, and reminded me that the ocean had many ways to punish complacency. The darkness was patient, but we were not blind. The hull shuddered slightly, a small but unmistakable vibration that set my nerves on edge, and I immediately remembered the ninth rule: never attempt repairs outside the submersible without a tether and safety protocol. Mark was already glancing at a minor panel malfunction, clearly tempted to climb out and fix it himself. I caught his arm, gripping firmly, a silent warning echoing the gravity of the rule. The Black Sea was patient, indifferent, and lethal. One careless step outside without the proper precautions could mean instant death under crushing pressure. Every second of hesitation, every flicker of thought about shortcuts, made my stomach tighten. The currents around the submersible shifted subtly, tugging against our small craft in unpredictable ways. I checked the tether lines, ensuring they were secure and prepared for any external adjustments. Mark's hands trembled slightly, his fingers brushing the emergency tools, and I reminded him silently that compliance with the ninth rule wasn't optional. Even a minor deviation could place him in the abyss's hands, a victim to the crushing water and darkness just beyond the hull. The thought of losing control outside, unmoored, made me shiver, despite the warmth of the cabin. Minutes passed as we debated whether to risk adjusting the external instruments from inside the submersible. The malfunction was minor, almost negligible, but the ocean's patience was infinite. Shadows outside flickered, shapes twisting against the lights as though testing our resolve. I reinforced silently to Mark that the tether and protocol were our only protection from sudden currents, unseen obstacles, and the abyssal creatures that thrived in darkness. The ninth rule was a lifeline. Without it, any attempt to step outside could end in instant catastrophe. The water pressed against the submersible with increasing intensity, reminding me that even the smallest movement outside was life-threatening. I double-checked the harnesses and ensured the tether lines were taut and ready. Mark's curiosity piqued, but I kept a firm hand on the console, guiding him with silent authority. The Black Sea tolerated no carelessness. Even an experienced diver outside without safeguards was a target for the crushing depth. Every pulse of pressure, every subtle sway of the hull reminded me that the abyss was patient and exacting. Hours passed as we monitored the malfunction from inside, resisting the urge to step outside without preparation. The lights illuminated drifting particles in the water, each shadow flicker suggesting hidden movement. Mark's tension grew, fingers twitching near the outer hatch, but I remained steady, forcing both of us to adhere strictly to the rule. The ocean beyond the glass seemed alive, its currents testing our attention, reminding us that ignoring procedure was an invitation to death. The ninth rule wasn't just a precaution, it was a line drawn between life and an unthinkable demise. Even during sample collection, the pressure outside reminded me that leaving the safety of the submersible was not an option. I observed the tiny deviations in water flow, the subtle vibrations along the hull, all indicators that stepping out unprepared would be fatal. Mark kept his hands close, finally acknowledging that the ninth rule existed for reasons beyond comprehension. Outside, shadows swirled, sometimes forming shapes too deliberate to be coincidental, reinforcing the idea that the abyss had ways to punish recklessness. Each second of adherence strengthened our chances of survival. The submersible tilted slightly as a sudden current swept beneath, and I tightened my grip on the controls. I could feel the vibrations through the hull, subtle but threatening, and Mark flinched instinctively. I reminded him with a glance and a nod that leaving the vessel without tethers and full protocol was not just dangerous, it was certain death. Outside, darkness pressed closer, currents tugged and shadows danced, a silent audience to any error. The ninth rule was as much about respect for the environment as it was about discipline. Minutes dragged as we stabilized the submersible, ensuring that any adjustments to external instruments remained safely inside. Every flicker of the lights on the hull illuminated alien shapes moving just beyond perception, forms the instruments couldn't detect. I reminded myself internally that the abyss tested patience and compliance, that any attempt to improvise could be fatal. Mark stayed close, hands steady now, eyes wide, finally internalizing the lesson. The Black Sea was indifferent but exacting, and following the ninth rule had kept us alive through another perilous stretch. The currents tugged intermittently, gentle but deliberate, making the submersible sway subtly. I felt the tension in Mark's shoulders, the tightness in his jaw, and I knew he had fully grasped the necessity of the ninth rule. The shadowy water outside twisted as if aware of our movements, testing our vigilance. Any premature or careless step outside would have meant being claimed instantly by the crushing depths. Compliance with the ninth rule was not just wisdom, it was survival, the fine line we needed to walk with the abyss watching our every move. By the time we reached a slightly more stable area of the trench, our focus had sharpened, tension etched in every movement. The submersible creaked faintly under subtle pressure changes, shadows flickering outside like sentinels, reminding us of the ocean's authority. Mark exhaled shakily but remained silent, fully aware that adherence to the ninth rule had preserved both our lives. Every second of safety, tethered to protocol, reinforced the lesson in this place. The ocean's patience was infinite, but its consequences for disobedience were absolute. The abyss was patient, but it would not forgive. A faint, rhythmic clicking echoed through the submersible, almost hypnotic, and I immediately thought of the 10th rule: never communicate with unknown signals or noises outside the vessel. Mark's eyes widened as he leaned toward the panel, curiosity battling caution, but I grabbed his arm firmly. The Black Sea was full of sounds that weren't random, currents, creatures, and unknown presences that could manipulate perception. Even acknowledging these signals risked drawing attention we couldn't afford. I reminded myself that silence was as crucial as vigilance. Interacting with the abyss could provoke consequences far beyond our comprehension. The clicking continued, irregular now, as though something was pacing alongside the submersible. I held my breath, listening, resisting the urge to respond, to acknowledge its presence in any way. Mark swallowed, realizing the danger, and kept his hands still, following the rules silently. Shadows outside flickered against the lights, twisting in unnatural ways that suggested awareness. Ignoring the signals might not be enough, but responding was certain invitation to danger. The 10th rule was about restraint, a barrier against engaging forces that did not abide by human logic. Currents shifted subtly, and the clicking seemed to synchronize with minor vibrations in the hull. I adjusted the thrusters carefully, letting instinct guide me while ensuring Mark remained calm. The sound was mesmerizing, almost coercive, drawing attention to parts of the trench we had no business exploring. I felt a tension building, a subtle weight pressing through the submersible, reminding me that some forms of communication were traps. The 10th rule was clear: no response, no acknowledgement, and survival remained possible. Any deviation could be catastrophic. Hours passed as the sound persisted intermittently, echoing and fading unpredictably. I scanned every shadow, every movement, and reminded Mark silently to observe but never react. The Black Sea's patient darkness seemed to respond to hesitation, amplifying currents and pressure changes with almost deliberate timing. Outside, shapes flickered, stretching into forms that weren't consistent with any known marine life. Following the 10th rule wasn't passive. It demanded focus, discipline, and the restraint to resist curiosity, no matter how strong. The abyss tested patience relentlessly. Even during specimen collection, the clicking returned at irregular intervals, weaving tension into every movement. I felt a chill, despite the submersible's warmth, aware that acknowledging the sound could attract something vast and incomprehensible. Mark's hands twitched near the instruments, but he restrained himself, understanding that the 10th rule was the fragile line between engagement and provocation. The ocean beyond was patient, but observant, and it would exploit even the smallest lapse in restraint. Every second of silence became a lifeline. The submersible groaned slightly under subtle pressure shifts, shadows stretching across the hull in ways that defied logic. I monitored the vibrations, the lights, and the patterns of sound, careful not to respond in any manner. Mark's wide eyes followed my lead, realizing that any attempt to communicate or mimic these signals could end in disaster. The 10th rule demanded that the abyss be treated with caution, that unknown forces outside remain unacknowledged, and that curiosity never outweighed survival. Even a single misstep could prove fatal. Currents tugged intermittently, making the vessel sway and amplifying the clicking outside. I gripped the controls, relying on both instruments and instinct, aware that the sound was more than just noise. It was a test. Shadows flickered beyond the lights, moving too deliberately to be random. Mark's tension mirrored mine, and I silently reinforced that the 10th rule required unwavering focus and obedience. The abyss was alive in sound and movement, and engaging with it would have been a fatal miscalculation. Minutes dragged, each second tense, as the clicking became a ghostly companion to our navigation. I kept the submersible stable, lights fixed, and attention sharp, trusting instinct over the allure of curiosity. Mark mirrored my restraint, finally internalizing that the 10th rule existed not for convenience, but for life itself. The Black Sea's darkness seemed almost aware, patient and observant, ready to punish any deviation from strict compliance. Silence was our shield, the rule our lifeline against forces beyond comprehension. The rhythm of the signals changed unexpectedly, slowing then accelerating, teasing, almost beckoning, yet I refused to respond. Shadows flickered with every beat, stretching in ways that made the hull feel alive, pressing in with unseen hands. Mark exhaled shakily, holding steady as I guided our navigation carefully. Following the 10th rule wasn't just about listening, it was about restraint, about survival under circumstances where curiosity could become lethal. The Black Sea observed, patient, waiting for the slightest acknowledgement to strike. By the time we reached a slightly calmer section of the trench, the clicking faded into distant echoes, leaving an eerie silence. Both Mark and I were exhausted, every muscle taut, every nerve alert. The submersible groaned faintly, under minor pressure shifts, reminding us of the environment's constant threat. Adherence to the 10th rule had kept us alive, preserving our vigilance against forces we could barely perceive. Outside, shadows still lurked, patient and watchful, a quiet reminder that the abyss tested compliance relentlessly and would exploit the next lapse without hesitation. By the time we approached the trench's darkest reaches, a gnawing dread had settled in my chest, and I remembered the 11th rule: never underestimate what lurks beyond the lights. What is out there may follow you back. Shadows outside twisted and writhed, shapes forming that defied logic, moving as though aware of every flicker of the submersible's lights. Mark swallowed nervously, eyes wide, finally grasping the weight of the rule. The Black Sea was infinite, patient and malevolent in its stillness. Ignoring the warning wasn't an option. The abyss had ways of extending itself into the minds of those who ventured too far. We navigated past jagged rock formations that loomed like jagged teeth in the faint glow. Every movement cautious, deliberate. Shadows coiled in ways that suggested sentience, reacting to our position and movement as if calculating intent. I adjusted the thrusters subtly, feeling the pull of currents and the presence of something unseen pressing against the hull. Mark stayed close, silent, eyes flicking to every shadow, realizing that the 11th rule was not hypothetical. It was immediate, visceral, and unavoidable. The abyss outside our lights was patient, intelligent, and relentless. Minutes stretched into hours as we moved carefully, every pulse of water reminding me that what existed beyond the beams of light was neither inert nor random. The shapes twisted, disappeared, reappeared, and I could feel a subtle pressure in the cabin, almost like a warning. Mark's hands hovered near the controls, hesitant, and I whispered internally that compliance with the 11th rule was no longer optional. The creatures or currents, or whatever forces haunted the trench, were aware. Every lapse in attention could allow them to follow us back, to breach the fragile barrier of safety we had maintained so far. The deeper we went, the more pronounced the feeling became that the abyss was alive, breathing, observing, and testing our every move. Shadows outside the hull coalesced into forms too vast to fully comprehend, stretching toward the lights but never entering directly. I monitored the instruments, but instinct guided more than any gauge could. Mark's whispered concerns about shapes moving unnaturally only confirmed that the Black Sea had intelligence of a kind we were only beginning to sense. The 11th rule was absolute: respect what is out there, or pay the consequences. Even during sample collection, the presence beyond the lights was undeniable. Currents tugged subtly at the submersible, shadows shifted in ways impossible to explain, and the blackness seemed almost aware of our hesitation. I guided Mark silently, eyes constantly scanning for anomalies, for any hint that the abyss was reaching beyond the lights to test us. Every movement reminded me that ignoring the 11th rule could allow the darkness to follow us back, to breach the fragile line separating survival from disaster. The weight of this truth pressed on every nerve. A sudden pulse of current rocked the submersible, and I felt the shadows react instantly, flickering violently in the lights, forming impossible shapes that seemed to follow every twist of the hull. Mark gripped the console, pale and tense, and I reminded him silently to keep calm, to obey the rule without hesitation. The Black Sea's patient darkness was testing our compliance, and even a minor lapse could have allowed something to attach, unseen, and follow us upward, beyond the safety of light. The 11th rule was clear: never underestimate what lurked in the dark. The trench seemed endless, a living void stretching beneath us, pressing against every panel, every window. Shadows twisted unnaturally, hinting at creatures, currents, or something we couldn't name, reacting to every micro-adjustment we made. I adjusted the lights carefully, keeping the path illuminated while resisting the instinct to glance at every shadow. Mark's quiet nod confirmed he understood that the 11th rule was not just guidance, it was the very reason we remained alive. The abyss outside our lights demanded respect, patience, and absolute attention. Hours dragged as we carefully navigated the final stretch of the trench. The shapes outside flickered, elongated, and shifted in ways that suggested intelligence, responding to vibrations, to the submersible's presence, and to our attention. I felt the weight of countless eyes, real or imagined, tracking us, testing, evaluating, waiting. Mark didn't speak, didn't move unnecessarily, following the rhythm of vigilance. The 11th rule wasn't merely advice. It was survival distilled into a single terrifying mandate. Whatever was out there could and would follow any misstep. Even as we began our ascent, the shadowy forms clung to the edges of our lights, reluctant to disappear, teasing, patient, as if challenging us. Currents tugged subtly, guiding the submersible in patterns that were not random, suggesting awareness. I kept our course steady, lights fixed, eyes scanning for every anomaly, and Mark followed without hesitation. The 11th rule echoed in every instinct, every twitch of muscle: never underestimate what lurks beyond the lights, because what is out there may indeed follow you back. The abyss was patient, but the moment of return would test us again. By the time we reached shallower depths, the darkness outside seemed to recede slightly, yet a lingering unease remained. Shadows twisted just beyond the lights, teasing, patient, and I realized that even surviving this descent did not mean freedom. Mark exhaled shakily, every movement tense, and I could feel the memory of the 11th rule settling into both of us. The Black Sea had tested our obedience, our instincts, and our vigilance, proving that what lurks in the darkness does not forgive, does not forget, and may follow even after we leave. Compliance had kept us alive, but only just. The submersible breached the surface, lights cutting through the faint reflection of the sun above, but the weight of the abyss remained. I glanced at Mark, both of us drained, every muscle tense, every nerve alert. The 11th rule had been the most terrifying of all, and even now, the thought of what might have followed us upward lingered. The ocean was patient, the darkness endless, and the lessons of the Black Sea, 11 rules learned at the edge of mortality, would remain with me forever. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.